ladies, thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's a sacrifice to come out on a Tuesday night, so I just want to thank you for coming out. I'm Lori. I'm going to share a little bit about Daniel 6 tonight. So I want to start by telling a story about this flight home that we had this week. We came back from a quick trip and we got the crazy guy on the plane. He walks in and he's super loud, and he's a little guy, but he's really loud. And the first thing he says is he starts complaining about how terrible it is to be in the back of the plane. Like, who really cares? And he goes on and he just keeps getting worse and louder, and he's being super crude. Like, we were all shocked. He's swearing, it just kept going on and on. And I know I was thinking, and I'm sure the other people on the plane are thinking, is this the guy? Is this the guy that gets tackled like in the air, that they straitjacket and that we have to make a special landing for? So we were all very on edge, waiting for something to happen. Finally, he makes just a ridiculous statement, and a kid sitting behind him, like a 20-year-old kid, says, "You need to shut up. Nobody wants to hear your complaints and you talking. You are being rude." And we all just kind of sat there, and his mom was like, "Shh, don't poke the bear." And the kid goes, "No, and if he won't shut up, I'm gonna make him shut up." And all of us were like, oh. And the guy didn't say anything for the rest of the flight. But we were so thankful that this kid said something. You know, we were in this spot where if he didn't say something, it was gonna make it worse for everyone else. Since I'd been studying Daniel, of course, the first thing I go to is, this is like Daniel, someone needed to stand up, and Daniel was willing to stand up. So we're gonna go straight into the text. We're gonna start where Natasha left off last week in chapter 5, verse 30. And it says, "That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So Belshazzar was killed in October of 539 BC, and Darius took over this huge empire. So just to get an idea of how big it was, in 560 BC, which was the closest date I could find, it covered 193,000 square miles. So California is 163,000 square miles, but we have cars to get, through California. And even that takes forever to drive from the north to the south. So you think about how huge this Babylonian empire was, and how much land it covers. So it's, the capital was Babylon. You guys know that. And that was about 50 miles south of Baghdad. Now, some of yours might say that Belshazzar was king of the Babylonians, and some might say the Chaldeans. So that was the southern part of Babylon, and those two things were used interchangeably. They add in these extra words, and then sometimes it seems more confusing than it actually is. So this story starts on day 1 of the new Medo-Persian Empire. These were two people groups, the Medes and the Persians, who had come together to defeat the Babylonians. And this is the empire that ultimately lasts from 539 BC to 330 BC, and it's that silver chest and arms that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream about. Verse 6, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss." So Darius had a legitimate concern about these leaders. They would skim off the top, and he needed to supervise this huge empire and even make it larger. We see down the line in the book of Esther, about 50 years later, that there were 127 satraps. So this empire was continuing to grow at this point. So for that reason, the king appoints 3 administrators over him, one of which was Daniel. Verse 3. "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent." So Daniel's coworkers know that he's going to get a promotion. And I just have to think that they probably thought of Daniel as like this goody two-shoes. He probably didn't go out and party with them. He was always honest. He spent all his time praying. He never broke the rules. always on the side of good, never taking a chance at being bad. And they needed supervision because they wanted to break the rules. So it seems reasonable that they would be worried about Daniel getting a promotion. He's going to rat them off for what he's doing, and then they lose their jobs. You add to that some jealousy that they weren't getting promoted, and even some racism. Here's Daniel, who's from a different country. He started out as being a spoil of war, basically being brought over, and he's the one getting promoted. They dug for dirt on him. And it's easy, like, since we're in this huge political time right now, to see how they put Daniel under the microscope. There's a great commentary from the Enduring Word that says this: imagine looking at a political nominee as hard as you can, at a public servant in office for some 50 years, and finding nothing wrong. No fraudulent expense accounts, no intern scandals, no questionable business deals, no gifts from lobbyists, no accusations from his staff. There were no skeletons in his closet. It's like impossible. Verse 5. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put it in writing. So Darius's co-workers and his enemies now examined his life, and they found nothing to attack, so they make something up, which it really shows their character. It's like, no wonder they needed someone to supervise them. The scripture says they needed to be made accountable, and now they've gone to needing to be made accountable to conspiring to murder. And their methods aren't all that new. They just lied. They went to Darius and said, all the leaders agree, which wasn't true because Daniel wasn't there. So all of the leaders didn't agree. And that reminds me of Satan in the Garden of Eden. He takes this part which is true, but then he adds to it, makes it a little bit different, and it's a lie. If you look at it from Darius's side, here's a new leader, right? And 99% of his leaders come to him and present this idea. What do you do? There's a lot of reasons he had to do what they ask. It had some merit. They're asking him to make every subject in Babylon acknowledge the authority of Persia and of Darius. It probably seemed like something that would contribute to the unification of the empire, make the empire stronger, make them know who was in charge, that Darius was in charge. It's a convincing argument to Darius. Then you throw in some pride, Daniel's pride, that he'd be worshipped by a whole empire, really the whole world. Pride gets us in so much trouble. We want other people to think that we're great. We really do. And even worse, our pride keeps us in trouble. A sin that we could have repented from and moved on festers because we are too prideful to confess it to God and to other people. I've sat in groups, you've sat in groups, where women have huge issues, sin issues, that they won't confess because they're too prideful to admit it. Don't let pride keep you from asking for help. Pride makes you do stupid stuff. It makes you say stupid stuff. Me too. And the only right answer is to repent. So verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room with the windows open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Daniel didn't argue back or plead his case to Darius, but he took his case to God like he did about everything. He prayed according to the scriptures because in 1 Kings 8, Solomon asked God to give special notice to the prayers of his people when they prayed towards Jerusalem. He He was one of 3 governors over an entire empire, and he had time to pray. That's convicting. But Daniel was aware of how great his needs are and how God was the only one who could answer his prayers. From the time he was young, he had no control over his life. You think about it. We think that we have control over our lives in a lot of ways. And that's why our prayer life, I think, is sporadic and why it's weak. We think there are things in our lives that are in our control when really they aren't. We don't see our great need for God. And that is another effective tactic of Satan, to convince us we don't need God, or to convince us that we don't need God all the time. He doesn't want us to have a disciplined prayer life like Daniel. So you guys who know me know I struggle with self-discipline. My word for the year, which I don't do every year because that would take self-discipline, this year is sedulous. And sedulous means showing dedication, commitment, and diligence, which would be the repeated work part. It's a word from the 1500s, which has lost popularity, surprisingly. You guys know that when you struggle with something and someone else is good at it, it brings out your ugly side. And that happens to me when I see people who are really self-disciplined, to be honest. I started reading this book about the Holy Spirit. Super great book. But the author starts out by saying, I've never struggled with self-discipline. I was like, oh, I can't relate to this book. One of the greatest quotes I have about self-discipline, it says, if you didn't struggle with self-discipline, you would be thin, muscular Bible scholars who don't waste an evening scrolling through Facebook. Why does God want us to be self-disciplined? It's not so we can have a perfect body. It's because the world's so tempting and these idols are so alluring. They promise to make you feel good, and they do for a while, but they pull you away from God. I hope you guys don't think I've mastered this in any way. So when I talk about you, I'm really talking about me. And it's an ongoing battle against sloth. And by sloth, I don't necessarily mean laziness. I read this great definition about slothfulness. It's about putting your attention on the wrong things. So I can get up early, I can go for a run, I can supervise my kids well in distance learning, make sure they have great grades, be super active at work. But if I'm ignoring the most important thing, which is God, I'm being slothful. You and I both need to continually fight this battle. It is a battle. For some people, it's easier, and for some people, it's harder. But God says in 2 Timothy verse 17 that he's given us a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. And he goes on in the Bible about self-discipline. Verse 11, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to God or any human being other than you, your majesty, would be thrown to the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So the decrees of a Persian king were unchangeable because he was thought to speak for the gods, and the gods would never be wrong. So if a king made a rule, it had to be right for then and for always. This is the same law that comes up, the law of the Medes that comes up in the book of Esther. In the story, it seemed like this law would only affect Daniel. Like they did target Daniel in this law, but actually it would have applied to all the Jews that were in captivity in Babylon. If Daniel hadn't stood up and taken one for the team, every praying Jew could have been charged, convicted, and thrown into the lion's den. And I think it'd be interesting to know if the authors of this law had considered that. Did they care, number one? And did they think that the Jews were going to concede? I don't know. That's one of those things that I'd like to know. Verse 13, then they said to the king, Daniel, who's one of your exiles from Judah, pays no attention, to your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So when the conspirators come to the king, they refer to Daniel as one of the exiles. They don't say one of your top 3 guys. They're going back in history. He's one of them. They said he didn't show any regard for the king, but that's another one of those half-truths. It wasn't that he wasn't honoring the king. He had shown honor to the king his whole life, but he wasn't willing to put the king above God. So King Darius is displeased with himself, and he responds differently to this report than Nebuchadnezzar did. When the boys wouldn't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, he immediately throws them into the fire. He is angry that people won't worship him. For Darius, he actually feels displeased. He's distressed about it. And he spent the remaining hours until sundown trying to find a way to get him out of this punishment. But meanwhile, Daniel has to wait. He has to wait facing death. Think about that. He knows at night he is going to be thrown into the lion's den. And I wonder, does time go fast because you have so little of it left? Or does it go slowly because it's agonizing? Verse 16. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." I watched some nasty videos about lion. Not like Tiger King nasty, but just like nasty. Lions, you can hear them roaring from 5 miles away. So I can't imagine Daniel walking towards the lion's den and hearing these lions roar. They weigh up to 400 pounds. They have teeth that are 4 inches long. They can eat 75 pounds of meat at a time. They can crush a cow's skull with one swipe of their paw. If the lion licked the back of your hand even a couple of times, it would remove all of your skin on your hand. But the worst part about it is that lions will eat their prey before it dies. So their prey can be alive, still trying to get away, and they're eating his intestines out. Daniel had no doubt seen people killed before, probably been killed by lions, so he knew exactly what he was facing. When I think about that, I think my prayer would have been smaller to God. I don't know if I'd been praying for God to rescue me necessarily. Maybe I would have, but mostly I would have been asking him to just let me die immediately. God, please don't let me be eaten alive by these lions. What could be scarier than walking to the lion's den? I really thought about that, and I was like, there's only one thing that's scarier than that. It'd be doing it by yourself. He didn't have any people with him, but he had God with him. He didn't have to face it alone. But when I look at like our unsaved family and friends, that's what they're doing. They're walking towards death, walking towards the lion's den with no one there with them. It's why they're so scared. It's why things are so overwhelming. They're facing it alone, and that is scary. And that's a reason for us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. For us to know for sure what happens when we die. For us to tell other people what happens when they die. For some reason, when Darius yells out to Daniel, he legitimately had a hope that God might have saved him. I can only think it must have been because he had heard about how God had worked through Daniel. Otherwise, there's no reason for him to have any hope that Daniel would survive a night with the lions. Verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the ring of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace, and he spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. So he sealed it with a ring. There's 2 reasons. It could have been to protect Daniel. Darius knew that Daniel had powerful enemies who might want to take matters into their own hand. Second reason might have been so that someone didn't rescue him from the lion's den. The king couldn't sleep. He had too much on his mind. He'd been deceived by his leaders. They'd set up Daniel, and now the king is responsible for the death of his most trusted employee. Darius is the most important person on earth at this time, and he could not save Daniel. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called out to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Now, the king could have sent someone else. That actually would have made more sense. It's not regal or respectable respectable for a king to take off running. You don't see kings running. You see kings stately. But he took off, and it says, and hurried to the lion's den. And in a lamentable voice, full of sorrow and grief, hoping, but knowing that God saving Daniel was just a last resort. Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and he shut the mouths of the lions. They haven't hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." He wasn't even mad at the king. He was so excited about what God had done and didn't hold it against the king. He realized that the king had been set up. I wonder if he rehearsed what he was going to say. As a woman, that's totally what I would have done. I would have had like all these different scenarios of how it's going to look when the king comes. Daniel's a guy. He probably didn't. He probably just said the first thing that came to his mind. Thankful to the king and thankful to God. This went from like the worst night of his life, right, to the best. And he wanted to share it. And I know that's true for us. When we are at the bottom and we see God just like swooping at the last minute, we want to tell people what happened. The king was overjoyed and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted out of the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So, you know when you say something stupid and you can't take it back? It's usually like I say something stupid and then I feel like it made me look bad or the people won't like us and I lay awake and I think, geez, I can't believe I said that. Like, why do I say such stupid things? Think about Darius. He said something so stupid and he couldn't take it back. But it wasn't just that he looked bad. It was that someone was going to die because of what he said. So he shows up and Daniel's alive. I can't imagine how overjoyed he must have been. It sounds horrible to us that whole families were thrown in. This was Persian custom, though, that dictated that on the account of the guilt of one, all the kindred should perish. It's like North Korea now, and it's very effective at keeping people in line. People don't want to risk their families, even if it's to do the right thing, especially if it's to do the wrong thing. I would assume that the leaders knew this when they made this plan. They had to know that they were risking their families' lives to get rid of Daniel. I mean, that just makes it even worse. How do you get to that point where you're willing to risk your family and your children's lives to get rid of someone in power who hadn't done anything wrong? Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of the kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Darius was convinced of God's power because he saw him act, and he wanted everyone to know. So he made it an edict that everyone in the empire had to be told about what happened. And the final verse says, "So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." I'm sure that Daniel did prosper. He must have been so busy. Literally, Darius had just wiped out the entire leadership team. They had to replace everyone. And I'm sure that Daniel was an integral part of that, of having to replace all those people. He was busy working. Daniel lived through these like unimaginably historic times, but his life was hard. God allowed the Jews to be taken into captivity because of their idolatry, as a punishment for their idolatry. He was kidnapped, taken away from his family. He probably never saw them again. The fact that he was thrown alone into this den of lions may mean that he didn't have his own family there. He was taken to this foreign land where he was brainwashed. They tried to brainwash him into worshiping other idols. But he continued to follow God and to use his gifts to serve him. He ended up serving under 2 different world empires. He lived to see his homeland complete 70 years of exile that was prophesied in Jeremiah. It was prophesied before it even happened that they would spend 70 years. And Daniel got to see those 70 years completed. And he lived to see Cyrus put on the throne and Cyrus allowing the Jews to go back to their homeland. It's crazy the things that Daniel saw. And I think when we look back in our lives, we're going to think it is crazy the things that happened during our lifetime. But for the vast majority of us, our life is nowhere near as hard as Daniel's. And I say this to you and me as an encouragement. Don't let our Babylon surrounding us distract us from God, from serving God, from worshiping God. Don't be slothful. Pursue self-discipline. Ask the Holy Spirit to give you self-discipline so that you can do the right thing. Focus on the most important thing, which is God. And don't go tired of doing good. So important. I'm thankful I got to spend the evening with you guys. I love you guys, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Thanks.